I never thought I would find myself in a situation like this. Yet here I am, sitting in the quiet of our living room, staring at the dim glow of the lamp, feeling the weight of a night that should never have happened pressing down on me, even before it began. My husband is in the kitchen, talking quietly to someone I barely know, his friend who had just arrived, and there's a strange air in the room, a mixture of tension and expectation that I can't quite place. I trace the rim of my coffee cup with a finger, trying to steady my racing thoughts, try to remind myself that this is just another evening, just another visit. But my heart keeps tightening in my chest, and I know I can't fool myself. Something is different tonight. Our marriage has always been complicated, not unhappy exactly, but distant. Love lingers like a soft shadow between us, familiar, yet lacking warmth. He is a good man, my husband, patient and sometimes kind, but lately I feel invisible, as if I exist merely to fill the space he once held for me in his heart. The laughter we shared has grown sparse, the touches rare and fleeting. I have tried to ignore the silence, tried to fill the empty spaces with small routines, cooking his favorite meals, keeping the house just so, but it never seems to be enough. And now, as I hear the low hum of voices from the kitchen, I realize that my attempts at normalcy have done nothing to bridge the gap that has slowly grown between us. When the doorbell rang earlier, I wasn't expecting anyone. My husband mentioned his friend casually over breakfast, saying he would stop by, but there was a hint in his tone I hadn't noticed before, a quiet urgency, an unspoken request hidden beneath his usual calmness. I greeted the man with polite curiosity, a smile that felt strained even as I forced it onto my face. He was handsome in a simple way, with a confidence that seemed effortless, a charm I hadn't realized I could notice anymore. He talked to my husband about trivial things, laughter spilling lightly into the room, and I felt an unexpected warmth at the sound of it. Then he turned to me. Just a simple glance, just a fleeting smile, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't attraction exactly, at least not entirely, but it was curiosity, a spark I had long thought extinguished. I found myself laughing at his jokes, feeling a flutter of excitement I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. And that's when my husband said it. Not directly, not in a cruel or commanding way, but his words struck me nonetheless. He suggested, gently, almost playfully, that I spend some time with his friend tonight. He didn't frame it as a question or a request, exactly. It was an invitation wrapped in a strange sort of challenge, and I froze. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what I had heard, trying to catch my breath against the pounding of my heart. I excused myself under the pretense of checking on something in the bedroom, but every step I took felt heavy, as though the air itself had thickened around me. I stared at the reflection in the mirror, at the woman staring back, questioning herself, questioning her own instincts. What was I supposed to feel? Salt? Betrayal? Confusion? There was a whisper in my mind telling me to run, to leave, to insist that this was wrong, but another voice, quiet, dangerous, seductive, urged me to consider it, to explore the feelings that had lain dormant for so long. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a precipice, looking down into a place I had promised myself I would never enter, and yet I couldn't turn away. As the minutes ticked by, I could hear them laughing lightly again, the sound drifting down the hall. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that it was harmless, that I should stay strong and ignore the invitation woven into the night air. But I couldn't. I felt drawn to the idea of connection, of attention, of being seen in a way I hadn't been seen for years. I sat back down on the sofa, clutching the edge of the cushion, and tried to steady my breathing, try to remind myself of loyalty, of promises made, of the life we had built together. And yet, with each laugh, each casual glance, I felt the walls I had built around my heart beginning to crack, threatening to crumble entirely. The night stretched ahead of me like an uncertain path, each step heavier than the last. I knew, deep down, that whatever happened next could change everything. Our marriage, my sense of self, the quiet, familiar world I had relied upon for years. And still, despite the fear, despite the guilt, despite the voice screaming inside me to resist, A part of me was curious. A part of me wanted to see where this path might lead, even if it led me into darkness. I didn't know yet whether I would step forward or retreat, but the choice was no longer mine alone. It had been placed before me, delicately, cruelly, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, demanding an answer before I was ready to give one. The day I went to Daniel's house, I kept telling myself to relax. I've been there before, once or twice, usually with Mark, usually loud and busy and filled with noise. This time was different, quiet, intentional. I noticed that difference the moment he opened the door. He greeted me with the same calm smile, stepped aside to let me in, and said my name in a way that felt familiar, even though it shouldn't have. The house smelled faintly of coffee and something clean, like fresh laundry. Everything was neat, almost carefully so, as if order was a habit he relied on. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, gesturing toward the living room. "You want something to drink?" "Water's fine," I replied. He handed me a glass and sat across from me. Not too close, not too far. There was space between us, but it felt charged like the air before a storm. We started with safe topics: work, school, Mark's never-ending ability to lose his keys. We laughed easily. It felt natural, which somehow made it more dangerous. At some point, the conversation slowed. The pauses grew longer. I noticed the way he leaned forward when I spoke, elbows resting on his knees, attention fully on me. It made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to, so he said gently, "What is it you're really worried about?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. I guess ending up in the wrong life." He nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "That fear doesn't really go away," he admitted. "You just get better at hiding it." I looked at him, surprised by his honesty. He stared at the floor for a moment before continuing. "People think once you make certain choices, everything settles. Career, marriage, expectations. But sometimes it just locks you in." I didn't respond right away. His words felt personal, heavier than casual advice. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled. "I don't regret the people," he said. "I regret not being honest with myself sooner." That sentence lingered between us. I felt it land somewhere deep in my chest. I wanted to ask what he meant, but part of me already knew, and that knowledge scared me. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, more to move than to do anything. I watched him from the couch, noticing details I'd never allowed myself to before. The tired set of his shoulders, the way responsibility seemed to weigh on him even when he was standing still. "When I was your age," he said without turning around, "I thought feelings were things you could ignore, that if you didn't name them, they couldn't hurt anyone." He returned with his own glass of water and sat back down, closer this time, though still not touching. The space between our knees was small enough that I was suddenly very aware of it. "I don't want to mess anything up," he added, "especially not with Mark. He's like family to me." "I know," I said quickly. "I'd never want that either." Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between us. Not a plan, not a promise, just recognition. That was the moment I realized how thin the line was, how easy it would be to cross it without ever meaning to. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. We talked more, but carefully now, as if both of us were aware of the edge we were standing near. When it was time for me to leave, he walked me to the door. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I am glad we talked." "Me too," I replied, and meant it more than I should have. As I stepped outside, the late afternoon light felt different, sharper somehow. I sat in my car for a minute before starting the engine, my thoughts tangled and loud. Nothing had happened. No rules had been broken. And yet I felt like I was carrying something new with me, something fragile and heavy at the same time. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from him. Just one line. "I hope you got home safe." I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen, fully aware that the smallest response could mean more than it seemed. After that afternoon, everything felt slightly off, like the world had shifted by just a few degrees, and only I could feel it. On the surface, nothing had changed. I still saw Daniel at family gatherings. He still laughed with Mark, still asked about my classes, still played his role perfectly. But underneath all of it, there was a quiet awareness, a shared understanding that never quite went away, that we didn't text often. When we did, the messages were careful and brief. A question about an interview, a recommendation for a book, a simple, "Hope you're doing well." Nothing that could be pointed at and called wrong. Still, I found myself rereading those messages late at night, searching for meaning between the lines. Guilt crept in slowly. Not sharp or dramatic, but constant. I felt it when Mark talked about how lucky he was to have a friend like Daniel. I felt it when Laura smiled at me politely, asking how school was going, completely unaware of the thoughts that tangled in my mind whenever I saw her husband. I reminded myself again and again that nothing had happened, that thoughts weren't actions. The reminder didn't help much. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed more distant. Not cold, just restrained. His jokes were shorter. His smiles didn't linger. Sometimes I caught him watching me from across the room, only to look away the moment our eyes met. It was as if he were trying to put space between us, and I couldn't tell whether that hurt or relieved me. One evening, Mark invited him over again. The three of us sat in the living room, the television on, but mostly ignored. Mark talked about work, about plans, about things that felt comfortably normal. Daniel nodded along, but his attention drifted. At one point, Mark stepped into the kitchen to grab drinks, leaving us alone for just a few seconds. "I've been thinking," Daniel said quietly, not looking at me. "Maybe it's better if we keep some distance for a while." My heart sank, even though I knew he was right. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "If that's what you want." "It's not about want," he replied. "It's about doing the right thing." Mark came back in before I could respond. The conversation shifted and the moment passed. Still, his words echoed in my head long after he left. Distance turned out to be harder than I expected. Avoiding someone physically didn't stop them from existing in my thoughts. I questioned my own feelings constantly. Was this really about him, or was it about being seen, understood, chosen? I didn't have clear answers, only a growing sense of confusion that a few weeks later, Daniel sent me another message. He apologized for being quiet and said he hoped I was doing well. I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar pull. This time, I didn't respond right away. I set my phone down and tried to breathe through the mix of longing and frustration. When I finally replied, I kept it short, polite, safe that he reacted the same way. The conversation ended where it began, unresolved. That night, I lay awake thinking about how easily people can become emotional anchors for one another without realizing it. How a few honest conversations can create bonds that feel deeper than they should. I wondered if Daniel was lying awake too, wrestling with the same thoughts, or if he'd found a way to compartmentalize them better than I had. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was the uncertainty, not knowing whether what I felt was shared or simply reflected back at me by circumstance. Not knowing whether stepping back was an act of strength or fear. I started to understand that even unspoken connections carry weight. They demand attention. They ask for choices. And eventually, they force you to decide who you want to be, not just in private moments, but in the lives of the people you care about. By the time I realized how much this quiet situation was affecting me, it was already woven into my daily life. In the pauses between classes, in the spaces between thoughts, in the moments when I caught myself hoping to see his name light up my phone, even as I told myself I shouldn't, nothing had happened. And yet, everything felt different. A few weeks after our quiet messages, the tension between us reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. I found myself standing in my room, phone in hand, staring at a message from Daniel that simply read, "Can we talk?" My chest tightened immediately. I knew this wasn't casual anymore, if it ever had been. There was weight behind those words, a seriousness I couldn't ignore. When I arrived at his house that evening, the air outside was thick with the smell of rain, the clouds low and heavy like they were bearing witness to everything that was about to happen. Daniel opened the door immediately, his expression unreadable. There was no small talk this time, no casual greetings. He led me into the living room, and we sat across from each other, the space between us smaller than usual, charged with unspoken questions. "I haven't been fair to you," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes at first. "Or maybe I've been unfair to myself. I I don't know how to deal with some things I've realized about who I am, and I think it's affecting you, whether I intended it or not." I felt my stomach tighten. This was what I had feared and hoped for all at once. The moment where honesty would cut through the haze we had been tiptoeing around. "What are you saying?" I asked softly, careful not to let my own emotions spill too much. That he finally looked at me, really looked at me, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made it impossible to look away. "I've been questioning a lot about who I am, about what I want, about the parts of myself I've been hiding. I never wanted to hurt anyone, least of all Mark or Laura, but I can't ignore these feelings anymore." I swallowed hard. My mind raced. I had imagined this moment countless times, but nothing had prepared me for the quiet intensity of it. "Daniel, we can't just pretend it's different," I said. "We can't act like this won't hurt people." He nodded. "I know. That's why I wanted to be honest with you. Because pretending isn't helping anyone, including us. But that doesn't mean we have to act recklessly. I care about you, Ethan, more than I can explain, but I also care about doing the right thing." I felt a strange mixture of relief and pain. Relief that the truth was out in the open. Pain because that truth complicated everything. It made my chest ache and my thoughts scatter. "So what do we do?" I whispered, knowing that the answer wasn't simple. Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "We step carefully. We don't ruin lives, but we also don't ignore who we are. That balance. I don't know if it exists perfectly, but we can try. Together, in a way that doesn't destroy anyone unnecessarily." I nodded slowly, tried to absorb the weight of his words. There was no promise, no plan, just acknowledgement of reality. And yet it was enough to make me feel connected to him in a way I had never allowed myself before, that we spent the rest of the evening talking in quiet fragments. About identity, about mistakes, about what it means to love someone without causing harm. Every word was careful, deliberate. Every glance carried meaning we couldn't put into sentences. By the time I left, I felt both heavier and lighter, burdened by the complexity of our situation, but liberated by the honesty between us. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and reflective. I drove home slowly, aware of the fragile tension between desire and responsibility. For the first time, I understood that sometimes the bravest act isn't to pursue what you want recklessly, but to navigate it with care for yourself and for others. That night, I lay awake thinking about choices, about boundaries, about the cost of honesty. Daniel had forced me to confront parts of myself I had avoided. And though nothing had changed outwardly, everything inside had shifted. The path forward wasn't clear, but at least it was real. And sometimes being real, even in pain, is the only way to start healing. Time passed, and life moved in its quiet, unrelenting way. The intensity of those weeks with Daniel faded into something softer, like the memory of a storm that had passed, but left the air fresh and sharp. I saw him at family gatherings, and we spoke, but the words were lighter now, measured. We had learned how to coexist without crossing the line, how to care without claiming, how to acknowledge the bond between us without letting it spill over into regret or betrayal. Mark noticed a change in me, though he couldn't quite name it. I was quieter, more thoughtful, and perhaps more careful with my words. I didn't share what had happened between Daniel and me, and I never would. It wasn't about shame, it was about respect. The truth was too fragile for casual conversation, too heavy for idle curiosity. It belonged to the space between me and him, and that was enough. Daniel seemed to change too. He laughed again with Mark, his calm presence returning to the role everyone expected of him. There was still a careful distance, a subtle restraint, but it no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like understanding. A mutual respect had grown from our honesty, an unspoken agreement that some connections don't need to be acted on to be real, that I often found myself thinking back to that afternoon, to the way the light fell in his living room, to the quiet moments that had reshaped my understanding of desire and restraint. It wasn't about what could have been. It was about what had been said, what had been felt, and what had been learned. Those moments stayed with me, not as regrets, but as lessons in patience, empathy, and self-awareness. Over time, the ache of longing softened into a steady warmth. I could remember him without the pang of wanting something I couldn't have. I could recall the way he listened, the care in his words, without feeling guilty. It became part of my own growth, part of the story of who I was becoming, that I realized that love doesn't always require possession. Sometimes it requires restraint. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it simply asks that you hold someone in your heart without trying to own them. And in that holding, I discovered a kind of freedom I hadn't known before. The freedom to feel deeply, honestly, and without harming anyone. Months later, when I look back on everything, I understood that our connection had changed me. It had sharpened my understanding of myself and of the fragile lines between desire, loyalty, and integrity. It had taught me to notice, to listen, to value honesty over convenience. And it had reminded me that human connections are never simple, but they are always worth navigating with care. Daniel remained a part of my life in subtle ways. Texts about trivial things, a smile exchanged at gatherings, a glance that carried memories we didn't need to speak aloud. And that was enough. Not satisfaction, not ownership, but acknowledgement. Respect, presence. Sometimes late at night, I think of him, and the memory of that quiet afternoon still brings warmth to my chest. Not longing, not regret, but recognition. Recognition that some relationships are never meant to be fully realized, and yet they leave an imprint that shapes who you are forever, that I, in the end, It wasn't about what we could have done. It was about what we chose not to do, about the boundaries we honored, and about the honesty that guided us through something complicated and deeply human. And that, I realized, was a kind of love too, one that didn't destroy, one that didn't demand, and one that quietly endured.